right, this is lecture 3, covering Socrates, who is considered the father of Western philosophy. We'll start off with a bit of a bio. If you remember in the last lecture, I talked about how ancient Athens was a direct democracy, meaning that the adult male Athenian citizens um, they directly participated in the running of government through a variety of means, and how that democracy was threatened for several months by the 30 tyrants who took over by using the persuasive rhetoric that they had learned from sophists primarily, and gaining large numbers of followers to kind of create little miniature armies that they used for seizing control of the democratic process in Athens. Until, right, the pro-democracy Athenians were able to get their own forces together and then oust them and execute some of these tyrants, including Critias, who is largely considered the leader of them. So, coming back to Socrates, Socrates was an old man by the time these events had occurred. So, coming back a little bit in time, Athens was, Socrates was what we would call a working class Athenian citizen, meaning he had the full rights of a citizen. He could be called to jury, he could sue and be sued, and in fact, he had participated in defending Athens on a number of occasions, including in the Peloponnesian War. Um, and Socrates was, in fact, a war hero because of what he had done during the Peloponnesian War. But because he was from the working class, he had little to no property, and he often had to work with his own hands for income. In particular, he, like his father, was a stone quarryman. You see a picture there, obviously not from the correct time period, but, he worked with large chunks of stone in a quarry. He was not a sculptor or an architect or, a construction worker. His job was primarily just to find large pieces of rock and chisel them out of the caves or mines or the quarry, and then transport them to a building site or to the marketplace. And as a result, you see in the next bullet there that he had an incredibly basic education, which he received from the mistresses of political leaders and from midwives. And this raising by and education by at the hands of women like midwives would definitely influence Socrates' own later views. In fact, he's famous for saying that the philosopher and the teacher must act solely as a midwife and a matchmaker to students, merely assisting them to give birth to their own wisdom and finding them the appropriate views by which to lead their lives best. And so, obviously he's drawing from his own experiences, his own education, when he's making these conclusions as an adult. Socrates never wrote anything himself. Most of what we know about him is through the writings of his star pupil Plato, whose real name is Aristocles. As I mentioned already, he was a hero from the Peloponnesian War, and he became more famous afterwards later in life through his use of the Socratic method of dialectic. Dialectic is the use of questions on someone about their views in order to kind of examine and expose the consequences of such a line of thinking. If the line of thinking leads to something logical in its conclusion, then you're fine, you proved yourself. However, if the line of thinking leads to something, of a contradiction, to some problems logically, or just leads you to consequences you're not happy with, then dialectic also uses questions in order to explore other relevant avenues of thought through similar interrogations. Interrogated individuals on their views on justice, religion, honor, the good, virtue. This is what Socrates spent his free time doing. He would go to a place called the Agora, which I mentioned in the last lecture. The Agora is an open air marketplace where citizens of Athens debated proposed laws, where they settled court cases, and where they took votes, while their wives and their slaves did the shopping for the home. So the Agora is where a lot of the democracy actually took place in terms of ancient Athens, and that's where Socrates spent his time interrogating people, using his dialectical method to try to get people to expose what they thought and what they believed, and try to examine whether those were good ideas or not. Why did Socrates do this in the first place? As you can see in the next bullet, Socrates was pushed to this course of action by the Oracle of Delphi, which was a priestess of Apollo known for wisdom and prophecy. According to the Oracle at Delphi, none in Athens were wiser than Socrates. And when Socrates ends up hearing about this, he couldn't believe that no one was wiser in Athens. His claim was that the only thing he knew is that he knew nothing. And so when the Oracle of Delphi claims that no one is wiser than him in Athens, he sets out testing that prophecy by interrogating people in the Agora in order to try to find whether there really was, anybody who might be wiser than him, and disprove what the oracle was saying. But what he found instead was that people were not only as ignorant as him, but they were doubly ignorant, right? And this kind of introduces a key concept for Socrates. In the Platonic dialogue, the Apology, we see Socrates defending himself in court, and one of the concepts he kind of brings up is the idea of simple ignorance versus double ignorance. Simple ignorance is basically when you don't know about something and you recognize that you don't know about something. So, for example, if I were to ask you to write down the chemical formula describing the reaction created by the Krebs cycle in the cell as it breaks down food into energy, most of you would not be able to do that. You would just tell me, I don't know what you're talking about, sir. And that's fine, right? You recognize that you're ignorant. You're simply ignorant about that chemical reaction. However, double ignorance is when you think you know something, but you don't. In other words, you're twice ignorant because you're ignorant of your own ignorance, right? And we see a quote in the Apology where Socrates says, I thought to myself, I am wiser than this man. Neither of us probably knows anything that is really good, but he thinks he has knowledge when he has not, while I, having no knowledge, do not think that I have. And so he's making the distinction, right? Socrates admits that he's simply ignorant. The people he's interrogating, however, don't recognize that they're ignorant, right? They have that double ignorance. The problem with double ignorance, as you see in the next bullet, is that if you think you already know something, then you're never going to set out to learn about it. You're never going to fix that ignorance. You're never going to educate yourself. And so you persist in the double ignorance, and you make decisions based on this ignorance, which leads to evil and suffering unintentionally for you and for others and for the city-state, the polis. This is why Socrates says that men do evil out of ignorance. Socrates makes it very clear. People make decisions based on the idea of what they think is good. However, what he's pointing out in the quote is that in the end, most of us don't really know what the good is. We think we do. We have double ignorance about the good. We think we know what the good is because it's one of the first words we learn as children, right? Think about little kids, if you have any in your house. Good is one of the, probably in the top 10 words that they first learn, right? How's the ice cream? Good, right? Did you like the movie? Yes, it was good, right? So, because the word good is one of the things that we learn early on, we kind of assume as adults that we know what the good really is. And yet, the fact that our lives are such a mess, the fact that our political system is such a mess, the fact that we can't agree on anything, these things suggest to Socrates that in the end we have double ignorance. We think we know what the good is, but we really don't. And that's why he agrees with the Oracle of Delphi when the Oracle of Delphi pronounced that according to Apollo, we must know ourselves, right? We should spend our life gaining knowledge of ourselves. And in particular, what Socrates means by this is that we should make serious effort to know ourselves in the sense that we know what we know and what we don't know. We recognize the limits of our knowledge. By doing so, by recognizing the limits of our knowledge, we're less likely to make mistakes because then we recognize we don't know something and we refuse to make a decision until we gain more knowledge. So double ignorance in the end winds up being kind of the source of evil and suffering for Socrates. However, this quest of Socrates in the Agora to interrogate people led to a growing resent from the most powerful men in Athens, in particular because those powerful men are the ones he was interrogating with his dialectic. The reason for that is because they're the ones who claim to know things. So, you know, Socrates would go up to somebody like this guy named Thrasymachus and ask him about justice because Thrasymachus was always in court. And so the idea was he had a political career in the court system because he made claims to know about justice. Yet, when Socrates interrogated him, it became very clear that Thrasymachus didn't really know what he was talking about. And this caused Thrasymachus, along with a lot of other powerful men, to begin to dislike Socrates, and they publicly ridiculed him at the beginning, but later it would lead to a court case that would threaten his life. In the meantime, other people didn't like Socrates because of what they saw in a play called The Clouds, written by the famous Aristophanes. Those of you that like world literature, you may have heard of him. In the play, they present Socrates as a character who's so busy looking up at the sky, that's where we get the title The Clouds from, because he's trying to figure out what clouds are made out of and why they float. And he's so busy looking up at the sky, trying to come up with theories, that he accidentally steps into horse manure on the streets in one of the scenes. And so this is kind of like an example of the way not only Aristophanes saw Socrates and other philosophers and sophists, but the way that other Athenians grew up seeing Socrates as well. So there was a lack of respect for him. There was also a lack of respect for him because he worked with his hands. In Greek society, working with your hands was something considered for slaves and for women. And so the fact that Socrates worked with his hands was looked down upon by wealthier, more powerful citizens of Athens because of their biases. And the last reason a lot of people didn't like Socrates was because, in particular, Critias, who we know from the 30 Tyrants, was one of his former students, right? And so while a lot of the other tyrants were educated by the sophists, Critias, the leader, was educated by Socrates. And so a lot of people in Athens began equating Socrates with the other sophists, right? They started blaming him for Critias as well. And so when enough of the unpopularity rises up amongst the common opinions of the citizens of Athens, three guys in particular, one of them being Thrasymachus, another guy named Meletus, and then a third guy who's not that important. They bring up charges against Socrates and they take him to trial. As you can see in the next bullet, he was charged with being a sophist, second with being an atheist, and third with corrupting the youth. And the last one in particular, well, really, I mean, the last two, being an atheist, right, being impious, not worshiping the gods, and corrupting the youth, were charges that, if found guilty, could carry either a sentence of exile, being kicked out of Athens forever, or execution. Um, this trial is recorded by Plato in a dialogue called the Apology, which is in your textbook, and it's up to you to read from it. Um, and so some of the quotes that I have are from that book, and we'll look at these together here in this lecture so that we can understand what are the philosophical ideas Socrates is talking about. This is one of the more historically accurate dialogues that Plato wrote, and so we can kind of take it for granted that these ideas are coming from the historical Socrates. And so in the first bullet we have here, we see that Socrates says, wealth does not bring about excellence, but excellence makes wealth, and everything else good for men, both individually and collectively. I say that it is the greatest good for a man to discuss virtue every day, and those other things about which you hear me conversing and testing myself and others, for the unexamined life is not worth living. And so, one of the things Socrates is pointing out is that most of the powerful men in Athens were concerned with making money, right? Wealth. And then once they became rich, they thought that that was a sign of their excellence, of their virtue. But what Socrates is pointing out is that just because you're rich does not mean that you're an excellent human being, right? Often the opposite is true, right? Often people who make themselves rich do it at the expense of other people, and often at the expense of the state as well. They take advantage of the system to benefit themselves. And so Socrates points out that instead of pursuing wealth, right, the good man wants to pursue excellence. Now you have to remember, excellence for the ancient Greeks, arete, right, means virtue, right? Virtue is the Roman word for excellence. So is arete for the Greeks. And so when they talk about living a good life, for the Greeks and for the Romans later, what that means is being an excellent human being, right? Being excellent at whatever your profession is, being excellent as a parent, being excellent as a spouse, being excellent as a citizen. And so you can only reach a good life, eudaimonia, by achieving excellence in these different things, right? And so what Socrates is telling us is, to reach that good life, it's not enough to get rich. You have to instead focus on reaching excellence, finding those skills necessary and that knowledge necessary that are required for a person to become good at all those things. And that's why he spent all this time discussing virtue, right? For Socrates, when he says the unexamined life is not worth living, what he means is that people who lack excellence, who lack knowledge, their life is not worth living even if they're rich, because there's a lot of other things that are going wrong in their lives, right? They surround themselves with the wrong people who are after them for just the money. They raise their children in a way that makes them spoiled, perhaps. And then they grow up and they don't know how to handle the wealth, and they don't know how to take care of their own parents when they grow old. There's all kinds of things that can go wrong if you don't have wisdom and knowledge, for Socrates. In the next quote, he says, "The state is like a great and noble steed, who is tardy in his motions, owing to his very size, and requires to be stirred into life. I am that gadfly which God has attached to this state, Athens, and all day long, arousing and persuading and reproaching. You will not easily find another like me." And so, a gadfly is what we call the horsefly. It's those big flies that are always buzzing around the horse, biting from it, and that the horse gets annoyed and tries to like whip with its tail, right? And Socrates is comparing himself to that. In fact, it was one of the nicknames that his enemies had given to him, and here we see Socrates owning that name and making it his own. And what he's arguing is that the horse is the city, and that the city is so big and slow to move that often it slips into corruption. And so the gadfly, just like the gadfly forces the horse to run, forces the horse to be aware and awake, Socrates is that fly. He's been sent by God, notice singular God, with no name Zeus after it. Um, he's been sent by God in order to kind of annoy and stimulate the city with his questions and his cross-examinations, right? As a way of kind of getting them to think about virtue and goodness and becoming better than what they already are. Um, in the next quote, you see him referring to God again in singular, right? And so, this is one of the reasons why they accuse him of impiety, right? They accuse him of impiety, in other words, breaking the religious rules, because he doesn't ever make references to Zeus or Hera or Athena or, Ares. He refers to them sometimes, but only as characters in Homer's plays, or poems. Um, he doesn't ever refer to them as the real gods, the way most Athenians would have back in his time. He always just talks about the one God. And some scholars of Socrates have argued that perhaps Socrates was monotheistic, like the Jewish, the Christians, and the Muslim people. And so that would have probably been problematic for other Greeks because they were polytheistic. And so, continuing with the next quote, Socrates says, "Men of Athens, I honor and I love you, but I shall obey God rather than you. And while I have life and strength, I shall never cease from the practice and teaching of philosophy. Understand that I shall never alter my ways, not even if I have to die many times." And so, one of the things we see from this quote is that Socrates is an objectivist. He believes there is, one truth defined by God, and that truth is more important than any of the things that human beings can do to you, right? And so he takes it as his mission in life to practice and teach philosophy, which is the pursuit of wisdom, because it's the destiny created for him by God, right? It's a path. And so notice he makes it very clear that he's not afraid to die, that he's willing to live by the truth and live for the truth and die for the truth if he has to. And so this kind of shows Socrates as an objectivist. He recognizes that there's something higher than what he wants, something higher than what he thinks, something higher than what he feels, right? And something higher than all of us even. A higher truth, a greater good. And so Socrates is kind of trying to make other men in Athens recognize that in order for democracy to work, we have to serve something greater than ourselves, right? It's not about money and power. And so one of the things that Socrates is in a way also warning us of is that the threat to democracy is not over just because they got rid of the 30 tyrants, right? That the 30 tyrants were only possible because there's already problems in the democracy to begin with. Namely, people with power and wealth thinking that they're better than everybody else and taking control of the system to benefit themselves, right? And so Socrates is kind of, his questions are kind of exposing these weaknesses in the democracy. He says in the next bullet, "For to fear death, my friends, is only to think ourselves wise without really being wise. For it is to think that we know what we do not know." There's that double ignorance again. "No one knows whether death may not be the greatest good that can happen to man. The difficulty, my friends, is not in avoiding death, but in avoiding unrighteousness, for that runs faster than death." And so, one of the things that he's pointing out here is that the other problem with democracy, besides the rich and the powerful and the corrupt, is everybody else. Everybody else tends to bow their head down and accept systemic injustice because they're afraid to die. And what Socrates is pointing out is, why are we afraid to die? We don't know what happens after death, right? And as he points out, for all we know, death might be a good thing, right? Now, he's not saying we should, run towards suicide, but what he's saying is we should quit being scared of death. We should no longer let the fear of death prevent us from doing what's right. And what's right is speaking the truth to power, speaking the truth to people, especially in a democracy. Um, if you're noticing some parallels between what Socrates is addressing in ancient Athens and what's happening in America today, good, you're on the right track, right? One of the things I want you to recognize is that these philosophers that we're going to be covering throughout the semester, the reason we still read them is because a lot of what they say is still applicable to the world we live in today. And so, Socrates is kind of telling the people listening there in the middle of the jury, in the middle of this court case, that they should quit being cowards, right? And they should stand up to power when they see it corrupting the democracy of their city. Notice the other thing he keeps pointing out is this kind of distinction between philosophy and power, right? And so he says in the next bullet we see that a philosopher, a lover of wisdom, becomes a good man who cannot be harmed either in life or in death, right? In other words, when you're serving wisdom and truth and looking for the good and trying to work towards excellence, right? One of the things you lose is fear of death, and once you lose that fear of death, there's nothing that people can do to you, right? Like there's no way that they can force you to be bad or evil or full of vice or unvirtuous. Um, they can't threaten you anymore, right? You become free of all of it. Now, they can kill you, but as Socrates pointed out in the last quote, we don't know that that's a harm. We don't know that that's a bad thing, right? They may actually be doing you a favor for all we know. So there's no longer, like with that, once the fear of death has been conquered, then there's nothing that people can hold over you anymore, right? The philosopher, the lover of wisdom, who becomes the good man, is different from the sophist. Remember, they're accusing him of being a sophist. So he points out that for the sophist, each of them is able, going into each of the cities, to persuade young people who can associate with whomever of their own citizens they wish to for free. They persuade these young men to leave their associations, leave their fellow citizens, even leave their parents, to associate with the sophists instead, and to give the sophists money, and then still be grateful for it, right? So one of the things that Socrates is pointing out, like the sophists, they go around convincing young men to leave their friends and family behind, follow the sophist, and give the sophist money, and then still be grateful to the sophist, right? He's admitting there's like rhetorical persuasiveness in sophists, but he's also pointing out that these sophists are greedy for money, right? And he's making that distinction because he's trying to point out that he's not a sophist, right? He never took money from anybody. He never asked anybody to leave their parents behind. He never asked them to leave their friends behind. In fact, he wanted them to bring their friends and their families together so that they could have these conversations together, so they could help each other get better. So he's making a distinction between himself as a philosopher and the sophist as something else, right? To address the charge that's being brought up against him. Moreover, he also points out he's not a poet, right? And remember what I talked about it 2 lectures ago, right? The vates, the storyteller, who comes up with these stories as a way of answering questions without really giving you a good answer, right? And so he says, as far as the poets goes, I took up those poems with which they seem to have taken most trouble, like Homer's Iliad or the Odyssey, and asked these poets what they meant, in order that I might at the same time learn something from them. I am ashamed to tell you the truth, gentlemen, but I must. Almost all bystanders might have explained the poems better than the authors could. I soon realized that poets do not compose their poems with knowledge, but by some inborn talent and inspiration, like seers and prophets, right? There's that Bates again, who also say many fine things without any understanding of what they say. So, in other words, when he would find poets, he would start asking them questions about their stories and the gods and so on, and the poets couldn't answer. And so, Socrates' conclusion is what most of the Greeks believed back then, that these guys are not geniuses, they must have been influenced by the possession by a god. And therefore, we can't really trust what the poets are saying because they don't really understand it themselves, right? They're just good with words. And that's the key point here. Socrates is trying to make it clear sophists and poets cannot be trusted because they don't really have knowledge. They're just good with words. But being good with words doesn't mean you really know the subject, right? And some of you may wonder, why is this relevant? Why is this important? Because today in the US in 2023, we still have sophists and poets who are good with words that convince you to listen to them, right? Lawyers, politicians, social media, um, you know, whatever you call them, the social media trendsetters, um, regular media, the people on the different news channels like CNN and Fox News and NBC, the people in the newspapers. These people are writers. That means they're good at writing, they're good with words. But what Socrates would point out if he were alive in 2023 is, but do they really know what they're talking about? And for that, you have to look at their lives. How many politicians talk about, values and family and the working class, but their families are a mess, or they're cheating on their spouses, and they engage in corrupt practices with campaign contributions and lobbying, and they work against the working class all the time in favor of the rich, right? The point Socrates is making is, don't fall for the words, look at their actions, look at who they associate with, look at who they benefit with, right? Um, and so that's how you make the distinction between the philosopher and the sophist and the poet. Do they show through their life that they know what they're talking about? Knowledge is action for Socrates. Now, at the end of the apology, they have a vote amongst the jury, and the jury was largely, um, you know, composed of allies and people paid off by Thrasymachus, Meletus, and the third guy. And so, um, the jury was stacked against Socrates to begin with. It was close. A lot of people, they just barely won in terms of finding Socrates guilty of the three charges brought against him. And so since they found him guilty, they went on to sentencing. And most people wanted to pick exile. They wanted to let him live and just kick him out of the city. However, Socrates never liked leaving Athens. He only left Athens twice in his whole life because he loved democracy so much. And he didn't want to go anywhere else where they had kings or militaries in charge. So Socrates decides to give one last speech to upset everybody, so that even the ones who voted for his innocence ended up voting for his execution by the end of the speech. And so in the next book, called the Crito, Plato tells us of Socrates waiting in jail for his poison to be executed. And Crito is one of Socrates' students who shows up in the middle of the night into the prison cell. He's paid off the guards, and he's trying to sneak Socrates out of the jail to help him escape to another city. But Crito doesn't understand that Socrates would rather die than live somewhere else. That's why he messed up the last speech at the end on purpose, to get people upset with him so that they would kill him for sure. And so in this next book, the Crito, we see Socrates tell, Crito the student, why, my dear Crito, should we care about the opinion of the many? Will life be worth having if that higher part of man, his reason, his soul, be destroyed, which is improved by justice and depraved by injustice? In other words, just because everybody's telling Socrates to run doesn't mean that Socrates should run, right? Most people, the opinion of the many, value life over justice, life over the good, life over the city or the state, right? That's why we're in the mess that we're in. Democracy doesn't work when everyone's pulling democracy in their own direction to benefit themselves, to profit their own pocket, right? And Socrates is pointing out that the philosopher, the just person, the person who tries to be good, is the person who values the good the good of the many, the good of the state, over the good of the self. Right? So, in the Crito, Socrates sets out to explain and prove to Crito why it's more important for Socrates to stay, drink his poison, and die instead of escape and run away. And so, in this next quote, um, Socrates is kind of pretending to be the laws of Athens, right? The laws of Athens that Crito's asking Socrates to break. And so the laws turn to Crito and Socrates and say, tell us what complaint you have to make against us, which justifies you in attempting to destroy us and the state. In the first place, did we not bring you into existence? And since you were brought into the world and nurtured and educated by us, can you deny in the first place that you are our child and slave, as your fathers were before you? Right? Now, the point here that Socrates is making is that the laws and the state have created us. We are who we are because of the upbringing and education that we received through the state. Um, you guys, most of you, you can read, you can write, you can think, and you're adults, and you're healthy, and you live in relative safety because of the state, right? The state created your schools. Um, the state made your roads. The state created the military that protects you from foreign invasion, and so on, right? Um, and so the point of this first, quote is basically the state kind of reminding Socrates and Crito that we all have a debt. By the time we become adults, we owe the state more than the state owes us. And so for a person who claims to have honor, you pay back the debt. And the way you pay back the debt is by following the law, even when the law turns against you, right? Because if you only follow the law when it works to your advantage, where's the honor in that? Where's the justice? There's no struggle there. It's not hard to do that. The key here is, like, what makes a person honorable is when they do what's right even when there's no reason to. That's the difficulty. That's the hard part. That's why there's so few good people around the world. Because most of us do what's good when it's easy, but most of us don't do what's good when it's hard. And so that's what this is, right? Are you fulfilling your duty, your civic duty? Are you paying back your debt to society by following the law even when it turns against you? In the next quote, Socrates says, for doing evil to another is the same as injuring him. Then we ought not to retaliate or render evil for evil to anyone, whatever evil we may have suffered from him. In other words, two wrongs don't make a right. And so even if the state has turned against you and made a mistake, returning evil for evil is not what we would call good, right? And so the point Socrates is making here is, if you're going to get vengeance, if you're going to hurt someone because they hurt you, how can you call yourself good when you look at yourself in the mirror, right? Most of us like to think we're good, and yet we go around doing petty, evil things of payback to each other. And breaking the law and escaping an execution is going to harm the law. It's going to harm the state because it sets an example for the students and followers of Socrates, that they can too ignore the laws when it turns against them or when it's convenient. Notice he says in this final quote here, he who is a corrupter of the laws is more than likely to be a corrupter of the young and foolish portion of mankind. In other words, remember that Socrates was accused of corrupting the youth, right? Because young people were following him because they liked the way he kind of embarrassed older, richer, more powerful men in public. And so the accusation of him being a corrupter of the youth, if he were to set a bad example and run away after all of his talk about courage and how death is not something to be feared and how it's more important to do what's good than to take the easy way out, like all of this talk, he's going to undermine it. He's going to set a bad example. In other words, he will finally be guilty of corrupting the youth if he runs away. Then he should have deserved the execution, right? So there's an irony here, right? The irony is that Crito is asking him to become guilty of the thing they're trying to execute him for. By asking him to run away, he will corrupt the youth to make other people want to run away from their responsibilities, from their duties to the state. He will finally be guilty of corruption by trying to escape his verdict of corruption. If that makes sense, right? So, in other words, Socrates sees this as a test. Is he really a philosopher, or is he in the end just another sophist and a poet? Somebody who's just good with words but doesn't live up to their own ideals. And so, as you see in the picture here, Socrates gives a final speech, and then he drinks his poison, and he dies. Right? He dies from the poison hemlock. And so, what we see is that Socrates showed us 300 years before Jesus Christ an example of what it looks like to die for what you believe in. This, in the end, is one of the key kind of ways in which Socrates influences Western culture. The idea that we should live and die according to our beliefs. The other thing that kind of shows the influence of Socrates is this idea that if you know something, you're going to live by it, right? That we should measure people in terms of what they know based off of their ability to live it. If you can't live it, then you don't know it. You're just good with words. You're just making empty noise. And so this pursuit of knowledge in order to affect one's life, this idea that knowledge is what leads to a good life, is the primary way that Socrates influenced Western culture. The reason we call him the father of Western philosophy is because of his emphasis on questions and reason and evidence in order to reach knowledge to live better lives, right? These are the ways in which he influences Western philosophy. Because from there, eventually we get to science, right? Science assumes that knowledge will improve people's lives, right? Hopefully you enjoyed this lecture on Socrates. Socrates ends up dying from his poison, and he leaves a lot of students, as you can see in the picture, very upset, including his best student of all, Aristocles, otherwise known as Plato, who's going to become our next philosopher in the next lecture.